Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rosie O'Brien-Wojtek, and I'm an Assistant Executive Director here at the Connecticut Association of Schools. On behalf of everyone at CAS, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a very special CAS Town Hall webinar with Professor Evan Mandery. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you of a few important items. First of all, we have everyone on mute today so that we do not have to worry about any background noise, so you will be muted. But if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A, or if you'd like to make comments, type those into the chat feature. We're going to try to get to as many questions as we can today, but we have a lot to talk about, so we'll see how we do in the next 60 minutes. And this session is being recorded and will be posted on the CAS website. So again, thank you for joining us today for this very special webinar, and let's get started. On May 17th, 2020, Politico published, "We're about to have the longest summer vacation ever. That's going to be a problem," by Evan Mandery, a professor for the past 20 years at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and a PhD candidate at Harvard. Professor Mandery wrote, quote, "Unless we act fast, some students are going to become a new set of pandemic victims," unquote. For years, educators across Connecticut have worked to close the achievement gap. However, since the need for social and physical distancing brought about by COVID-19, many educators have noted the greater risk and educational challenges for ensuring quality education for our special education, ELL, and economically disadvantaged students, most notably educational equity and access. As Professor Mandery explains, this is about to become the longest summer vacation in American history, which means we can expect the biggest summer slide, or what some are calling the COVID-19 slump, that we've ever seen. He continues by saying we can either rise to the challenge and perhaps even reform American education for the better, or leave an entire generation of children behind. The article by Professor Mandery is a must-read for all educators who care about equity and access to higher quality learning for all students. If you haven't read the article, we will drop the URL into the chat and link it to this recorded version of the webinar for CAS when it's recorded and put on the website. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Evan Mandery, who, along with being a professor for the past 20 years at City University of New York, SUNY John Jay College of Criminal Justice, is also the author of 3 novels, 3 works of nonfiction, including most recently, A Wild Justice, The Death and Resurrection of Capital Punishment in America. Professor Mandery is a regular contributor to Politico. He is the co-author and creator of Artificial, a live interactive series on Twitch, for which he has won a Peabody and an Emmy Award in 2019. Professor Mandery's areas of expertise are capital punishment, the death penalty, and educational equity and access. Professor Mandery is excited about his latest book, Harvard's Broken Promise: How Elite Colleges Have Betrayed the American Dream, which will be published by the New Press in 2022. Congratulations, Evan, on your forthcoming book. Today I'm excited.
There's a lot of work to do.
I'm sure. Today I'm excited to be talking to Professor Mandery about his May 2020 Politico article as it relates to education, equity, and access. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Evan Mandery to this special CAS Town Hall webinar. Welcome, Evan.
Thanks, Rosie. It's great to be here. I really appreciate you inviting me, and I just appreciate that your organization, which I checked it out, has such an interesting history and mission, that you're all taking the time to talk about these issues. I think it's great.
Thank you. We're glad you're here, and I've been waiting for this day since I read your article, so I'm excited. Let's get started. I would like to start by asking you, what inspired you or compelled you to write the Politico article?
Right. I think it's always on my mind, and I've lived like this kind of interesting life where I've bridged these different class divides. I grew up in Brooklyn in a lower middle class community. We moved to Long Island, where I grew up in a lower middle class community. My dad, who was an educator, he was a high school math teacher, then chairman, principal of Brooklyn Tech, and then he moved out to Long Island, where he was principal of Jericho High School. So I went to this very middle class school, and he was principal of one of the most affluent high schools in America. And now I see it in another way. I went to Harvard for college and law school. College in particular, I really was very sensitive to a class divide that I was looked at as an oddity. I'm not a person of color, but all of my roommates, all of my 7 roommates my freshman year were prep school graduates. And I work at CUNY, which has been, my parents are both CUNY grads, the best experience of my life. It is the most diverse college you can imagine. Quarter of our students come from families making less than $30,000 a year. I teach no rich white kids. But I live in a community that's almost all rich white people. We're the poorest people in that community, or not the poorest, but we're not near the top. And, I take my train from my relatively affluent school district and go to school in the city and teach mostly kids from low socioeconomic, low socioeconomic status. They're magical, brilliant. But it's kind of all I think about in my professional life is the difference between rich and poor.
Wow. So in your article, you describe some of the differences and challenges that bring about inequalities and how these inequalities are exacerbating the COVID-19 educational crisis. Can you explain a little bit more?
Right. At the moment also, I was thinking about how, the shutdown was affecting students differently. And I had a number of different perspectives. I was saying this to Karen just a moment ago. So I live in a pretty wealthy community. Our schools have done almost nothing since schools shut down. They just sent homework for a couple of months. And then they got to a point where my daughter, who's in 5th grade, would do an hour in her 5th grade, in her elementary school class, 4 days a week, nothing on Fridays. And it was not really any teaching. They would read a story to her. Meanwhile, in school, I put my classes immediately on Zoom, and I think you got basically the same experience that you get. But I ask every young person or person who's in education how much teaching they say going on, and I see massive disparities. Now, my kid, I'm not going to let my kid not learn for 6 months, so I homeschool her. I homeschool her and a group of six of her friends. So I'm now a 5th grade teacher. I do 2 hours a day on Zoom.
And how's that going?
Amazing experience. First of all, I challenge anybody who says that it's not doable. I don't know, I'm not teaching 24 kids at a time, so maybe there's some need to divide into groups. But the question of whether kids can learn on Zoom, I believe, has been asked and answered many, many times over. But I'm like, okay, great for, my daughter's very nice about it, but maybe she doesn't, she might say she doesn't love it. But I have a math background. I can do a pretty good job of that. I think I'm a relatively experienced teacher. Not everybody has that resource. Not everybody even has a parent at home. So what's the differences? And then, we know this data to begin with. But when you extrapolate from what we know about summer slide, you know who's going to pay out of this. And nobody's reckoning with that. And very few people are reckoning with it. And it's very disheartening.
Let's talk about what you mean by summer slide. So the summer slide, summer melt, COVID slump. Let's talk about exactly what you're talking about with that, and then how that goes beyond just test scores. So
Right.
Give us, just for anybody who might not have the statistical background that you put into your article, let's talk a little bit about that and then how that affects the summer slide.
So it's kind of, it's a pretty simple idea. Everybody jokes that Japanese schools do better than American schools. They don't. When kids are in school, they learn at pretty much the same rate. That's true for rich and poor kids. It's true for Japanese and American kids. Whatever your gain is, take a metric, take like the NWEA mapping test, right? So we can say you're going to learn, in 10 months, you're going to learn about 10 months. Maybe there'll be some variation. The big ticket item is, and the disparity is what happens when you break from school. So you take, most kids will learn 10 months of material in 10 months. Then the Japanese schools stay open for another month and a half. They continue on their upward trajectory. And this is the difference. In America, the rich kids, they make smaller gains. They continue to make smaller gains, which is because most of them go to camp and have some type of enrichment opportunity. But the low SES students, they fall back. And all of that fallback is cumulative. So even if, the rich kid is continuing to progress at the normal pace, and he or she learns another month and a half worth of, mental growth, well, now the poorer kid is a month and a half behind. But after 10 years of that, well, now that's 15 months. That's a big gap. So every teacher understands that they have to cover some material that was in last year's curriculum, but that doesn't completely compensate the difference. And I thought you asked, the way you framed the question was really excellent, because it's not just learning gains, it's social skill gains, right? So much of what school is providing is an opportunity for social and emotional learning to occur, in an environment in which that occur. And if you're not going to camp, that's not happening. And it has, the summer slide effect affects academic outcomes, but it also correlates very closely with dropout rates. And, there's an interrelationship of these mechanisms that's very, very detrimental to the kids that get left behind.
Right. You also write about a daunting dynamic of the crisis is the lag between actions taken now and their later consequences. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Well, that's more of a testing problem. It's a huge problem. So I don't know what you see, but where I live, they keep saying, well, next year we hope to have kids back in school, right? Well, of course, everybody would like for things to be normal. And it's incredible. We are in the middle of a first wave of a pandemic. Maybe we're at the tail end in New York and Connecticut. We know with certainty there will be a second wave, right? And we know with virtual certainty that there will not be a vaccine in time to prevent that second wave. And yet, I don't hear, certainly where I live, I don't hear anybody saying, actually at my college it's a little different. I don't hear anybody saying, hey, we must have a plan in place to deal with this. Now, what's peculiar, so you have two effects there, right? I don't know if any of you have read Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It's one of my favorite books. Humans overall have a capacity to discount deferred risks. That's why people live in San Francisco. We know there's going to be an earthquake in San Francisco, but you're like, maybe it won't happen tomorrow. Now this one's different. We know it's going to come in pretty much exactly when, 6 to 8 months. So you have that kind of predisposition to discounting events. And then you have a testing problem here, which is, well, we've suspended standardized testing for the year. So we haven't seen, right, these effects lag. So if I'm out of school for 2 months and I finally, you're not going to see that till you take your next ELA or Iowa test or whatever it is. Maybe that doesn't come for 6 months. Maybe we skip a year. We don't start to see that for a year and a half. So we can wish that won't show up in the data, but it will show up in the data. There is no doubt about what it will show. And then people will say, well, we never could have seen that coming. It's unfortunate.
Yeah, and crazy. You talk about moving your classes into Zoom. So I'm going to move to your college students and how you used, when you're looking at your students through Zoom, it's actually like it's opened up a window for you into what their life is like. Can you kind of compare your life working with those students in the inner city of New York versus the students that you're tutoring and working with out on Long Island?
Sure.
And kind of what you've seen.
But look where you're sitting, right? You were in a nice room with, drapes, behind you and a lot of light. And I know you said that your husband is there and making sure your dog doesn't come in. So you have help, right? You have a quiet environment and somebody who's helping you to produce a quiet environment so that you can do your job, and you'll be on with me for an hour. And I'm the same. I just ask my kids to keep it down outside. And I have a dog, he might come in. When they in my classroom, at least for that hour and a half, I can produce a learning environment. I can produce quiet. I can produce mutual respect. And, what they get out of it is somewhat up to them, but I can create conditions in which learning can occur. And when I look at the window, most of them don't have nice curtains. They, some of what I see is terrible. And I'll see people walking back and forth. They mute themselves. And then when they answer a question, I hear people are shouting in the background. Who can learn in a situation like that? And so I'm sure we'll talk about this. I mean, everybody understands that there are massive disparities in access, right? And it is a national problem. But access isn't the end of the problem, right? Isn't the extent of the problem. It's also how what your space which learning can occur.
Can you say that again? I think we lost you for a second.
Oh, sorry about that. What was the last
Okay.
word?
I'm not sure.
Um, the I was saying that part of it's not just having access to good Wi-Fi so that your connection is stable enough, that you need to have a space where learning can occur. You know, the woman I wrote the article about, it's true. She was living in this 2-bedroom apartment with 7 people, and she would show me, and she's one of the best students I've ever taught. She would say, "Oh, and there's my bed." And it was, you think I'm making it up, it was a toddler bed. And she was sharing the bed with her sister, who was 1 year younger than she is. And she couldn't sleep. So how do you go to school in a situation like that? And then, you know, her mother does telemarketing, and she would be on the phone during our class. So, I mean, and this, you know, this young woman had 1350 on her LSATs, and I promise you we'll go to a top 20 law school, you know, if we don't get in her way.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. And then you wonder how they can be successful and how that resilience and that whole piece.
Well, I mean, the ones that overcome it are extraordinarily resilient, right? We'd like to allow the people who are just kind of averagely resilient to succeed too. I mean, she's amazing, so she's going to be fine. But you know, lots of people will get discouraged. So.
You started talking about the inequalities and with technology, especially the digital divide and and the issues that we have with, you know, with making sure. I know we had it in Connecticut and across the country where all of a sudden we find ourselves, the schools are closed down. We've got to try to figure out how to do remote teaching. And yet trying to roll that out, even across Connecticut, we had schools where they were just giving out homework packets every week versus kids who had their own laptop computer or Chromebook at home. And some of them even one per kid in their family based on the districts that they're in. How do we provide equity across the line for all kids? How do we help every kid get access to the technology that they need in order to be able to, if we do have another wave, which we know is coming, how are we going to survive that?
Well, I mean, I think in 2020, it makes sense to have a 1-for-1 Chromebook policy, right? I mean, every kid should get a district supplied computer so that they're on an equal footing. I can't imagine not doing that. I'm sure it's an obstacle in many places, but there's a lot of philanthropic support for those, for computer access and Wi-Fi access. Again, I mean, you know, in a different universe, the federal government, which actually has some mechanisms in place to subsidize Wi-Fi access, would really be taking the lead on this. So, you know, absent that, I think you need to see local responses to doing it, but it has to be prioritized. And this is the time to do it if it hasn't been done already. I just want to say one other thing on it though. The equity issues are huge, but I hope equity in grading doesn't become a justification for not teaching. So I think what equity demands is that students not be penalized for if they don't have access, that grading not be harsh, but it can't be, well, 10% of our kids don't have good Wi-Fi access, so, you know, all we're gonna do is give hard homework assignments, because the first thing you said is really significant. Giving out homework assignments is not an equitable solution. It's great if you have a professor or a former principal at home, they're gonna, you know, you're gonna help your kid a ton. Well, say your mom and dad are both nurses and doctors and they're out, or say you're, you know, mom or dad, you only have one parent and they're out working at the hospital in, like, you know, support capacity, and they're not home to supervise the work. What if they can't? What if they don't understand the work? So schools are supposed to work for everybody, and homework, there's tons of research on this. Homework has a very differential impact on people. And homework needs to be used to support and reinforce concepts that are taught in school. It should not be as a substitute, not be used as a substitute for teaching.
Right. So what can teachers and educators do differently in order to, if not just giving the homework assignments, but making sure that all of our kids get the quality education that they need? What would you propose instead of homework?
Right. Well, one thing, I think the way we use classroom time, there's an invitation to rethink this. So historically, you know, teachers give their lecture in class and you do the homework at home, unsupervised, maybe supervised if your parents are so inclined. But technology opens the door to you watching the video at home, now coming to class, and we do the problem together. And the teacher's role is much more to answer questions, to act as a coach, a mentor, rather than to sit there and just deliver the lecture. So, you know, like kind of flipped classroom models, I think this technology lends itself very well to. You know, one thing I've learned in my time as my 3 months as a fifth grade teacher is I've used Khan Academy a lot. It's a spectacular resource. The lectures are very good. The problems are very well constructed. So I have my daughter and her classmates watch videos, then we do problems together. I mean, I don't have data, so I can't prove this to you, but I'm pretty confident I could show you what they've done on their tests. And we know there's an amazing study, if you're interested, his name was Eric Mazur. He was a Harvard professor. There's a article, I think it's in the New Yorker. I can find it in a second, post it in the chat, but he did this self-assessment. I actually took his class. And so he, you know, when you take these large classes, where I went to college or wherever, there are 200 people sitting there and the professor lectures and maybe somebody asks a question, but usually people are too scared to ask a question. So he used like clicker technology to try to determine how much people were learning during this class. And he basically found out that they were learning nothing. So the lectures were adding no value. And, you know, we know pretty well that what works is smaller digestible segments, right? 6 or 8 minutes, concept, problem to reinforce, opportunity to talk about the problem, maybe some room for small group discussion. So we know it. And this technology makes it incredibly easy. So first time around, if you want to record your own lectures, well, you'd have to make some investment to do that, but you'd have them forever. You don't need to record your own lectures because there are very, very good ones out there. So, I mean, I do think, you know, Rosie and Karen know I just ran for school board where I live. I lost. And one of the things I talked
We
about.
should have won. We should have won.
All right. One of the things I genuinely believe is that, you know, within this tragedy is a real opportunity. This technology used strategically is an asset. And I hope teachers will ultimately embrace it. Many have not. I see no downside. It's not going to replace in-person instruction, but as a tool, it's invaluable.
In fact, and you actually talk about in your article synchronous learning and how important it is to use online synchronous learning in order to help not only with the instruction, but for the social emotional learning and that kind of piece. So do you want to talk a little bit about how you see that piece?
Well, I'm sure you have plenty of teachers and administrators here who are going to have opinions about this. I mean, I don't think anybody's going to say that this is as good as in person. Although, look, you get more people to attend things like this. You don't have to drive an hour to go someplace. It's pretty good. When, you know, Karen and I were talking, when everybody has their screens on, I think it's pretty warm. I think actually, you know, you see what I like. You see, I like jazz. That's Kurt Vonnegut. I think you get a sense of somebody as a person. Maybe my dog will come in. You'll know I like dogs. I think it actually can be pretty warm. And I think what I'm responding to with that is this versus nothing. Well, that's not a question to me. This is way better than nothing. Now, if you think it's wrong for your kid, well, okay, then maybe it's wrong. You know, is it right 5 hours a day? I don't know. I think you can structure a day so that the kid isn't online 5 hours a day. We could do a 10-minute lesson, problem, breakout, like, you know, but the point is not to say, hey, get yourself up at 8:30, show up for class for an hour, and now you're off for the rest of the day. And, you know, I teach law and ethics. Like all I'm doing is discussion topics. You can have a very fruitful conversation with people, as I'm sure we will.
I think one of the things with synchronous learning too would be the building of relationships among students, because I know one of the greatest difficulties I think for students and even teachers was not being able to see each other from day to day, and kids being able to see their friends, et cetera. So I would see that as being one of the benefits of synchronous learning.
Of course. I mean, this problem, this problem, if this had happened in 1980, there would be no technological solution. There was a great technological solution. It's not perfect, but I would actually say in some ways it's better. How nice would it be to say, hey, there's 8 inches of snow today. We're doing an online day today, as opposed to we're going to lose a day of instruction. I think it's an amazing tool. And I briefly mentioned this in the article, my previous piece in Politico. I teach an ethics class, which is kind of like, it's just called Justice. It's modeled on a class I took in college that I loved. It's a famous class. The professor, Michael Sandel, you can find it online. You can actually take it online if you want. And I was interested after the election. I'm like, what's going on in America? So I was like, I'd be interested to teach ethics to a bunch of red staters. And I want to see whether they really think about ethical issues differently. So I taught the class. It's actually not as right-leaning as would have been ideal for my selfish purposes, but I taught the class at Appalachian State University. And I did a lot of it on Zoom, and it's great. They were respectful conversations. There were disagreements. Nobody called anybody bad names. I know a lot of learning went on, and I just think it's an incredible resource. And I was able to interact and learn from a bunch of students in a totally different part of the country, largely from the same chair I'm sitting in. I think it's an incredible opportunity.
Right. Or even right now, just the opportunity to do virtual field trips and go to museums and things. When we're talking about, the rich kids, the poor kids, and I know in your article you talk about the students who lower social economic versus the students who, how are more affluent, being able to go off and go to summer camp and go travel with their parents, et cetera, to be able to go online and see some of those places and experience some of those places, I think gives our kids a whole new opportunity that we didn't have before.
Completely agree. I mean, better to go to Venice, but if you can't go to Venice and you could do a virtual tour of Venice or see the Vatican and talk about it, I mean, it's amazing. And I just think, like, I don't know, like I said earlier, it seems to me like, sending home the packets, that's what we would have done in 1980. So I would really like to hear that is not the answer anywhere. Maybe not every place gets to perfect, whatever perfect is, but man, there's amazing potential.
You talk a lot about mastery learning too. Can you explain mastery learning and how you've talked a little bit about the flipped classroom, which could lead into that, but talk about mastery learning and how you see that benefiting students.
Well, so I see, I've been on this for a long time, but so when I teach the kids on Khan Academy, if I'm doing a math topic with them and they take a quiz and they get 16 out of 20, well, who says I need to move on? I'm not under any time pressure. They're not. You want to spend another 3 days on it and take it again until you get a 19 out of 20. It's good by me. I don't see who's harmed by that. And so that is kind of generally, I'm always struck by, I did during my campaign, I did a video with my dad who went to Brooklyn Tech where he was principal, where he still works. And I'm like, what does math education look like today compared to when you went to school? He's like, it's exactly the same. Like, we teach exactly the same. We teach the same subjects. There's a great, if any of you want to check it out, there's a great Freakonomics podcast. Steve Levitt talks about what percentage he collects some data on what percentage of people use algebra, geometry, trigonometry, and calculus in their professions. And it's like less than 5% in the biggest one, as opposed to what percentage of people use statistics or being able to manage, data, which is probably a lot. But we haven't changed our core requirements. We haven't changed. I have a bunch of math textbooks over there. They're the same ones. They're structured the same way. So like what Khan Academy to me, when you look at that, it's an invitation. It's just crying out, well, let people learn at their own pace. They have the resources there. You coach them. And I could say to you, oh, hey, Rosie, how'd you do? You got an 85. Oh, is that good enough? Could we do better? Maybe you want to spend another day on it, or do you want to move on? We can make a decision. I think that's the way like a parent talks to their kids about it. And, you know, in my, you're probably as an administrator going to be appalled when I tell you this. So in my district, it's the only one in Long Island that does this. They take some fourth graders and they pull them out and they double accelerate them based on what a couple of metrics, but mostly it's their COGAT score. So then those kids, they put them on a track to make multivariable calculus in their senior year, and everybody else is just on a path to calculus. That data is so obviously unreliable, right? Okay, what are you really picking up in fourth grade COGAT scores? Mostly you're picking out who's the oldest kid in the cohort, right? But you're telling me somebody who got a 134, you're confident that they can't do it, but somebody who got a 136 can. And then, you know, all of this tracking stuff, it has terrible stigmatizing effects. We know it's bad for the kids that are left behind, but it doesn't even produce any benefit for the kids who are accelerated. There has to be another model. And there is. It's you let kids learn at their own pace. So if somebody, you know, if a sixth grader can get themselves through to calculus in sixth grade, well, then that's it. Why hold them back? It's not going to be for most people. And I just think we've, for so long in America, taught to the middle of classes. Even when you do create homogeneous groupings, which are bad, they teach to the middle of those classes. And what's best is try to empower students to learn at their own pace, to create individualized learning plans, which we do for some special ed students. It's what's right for everybody. Everybody should be able to learn at their own pace. And this technology facilitates it. So I know maybe it's scary, but it's not like, this isn't like AI to me. This is, hey, here's an amazing video lesson and amazing support resources, and you can go and you can work on your own, and I'm here to help you. I think that's what my role as a teacher is.
Serve as a guide and facilitate that learning, as opposed to today we're here, tomorrow we're here, whatever.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, it's also, everybody who's taught understands the thing of value that they provide. Nobody who's been in a classroom believes that the lecture is the thing of value that they're providing. The thing that they're providing, I believe what I provide is I'm a model. I try through my life and work to be a model to you. If you want to be an advocate for social justice, I'm going to show you how to do that. And if you want to learn how to respectfully dialogue with people, regardless of what their viewpoint is, that's what I model. Now I'm going to teach you some stuff, but mostly nobody who learns in class. If you want to learn cases, well, you got to go read the case. Now you can ask me questions about it, but you're going to have to put the time in on your own. And, you know, if we acknowledge what the thing of value is, it's the helping you work through problems. It's helping you create a plan for your personal development that will move you forward the best. That's what my best identity is as a mentor. Then why do we sit there and say, okay, I'm going to spend 20 minutes and lecture to you about, you know, whatever, the history of the Emancipation Proclamation. That's great. Better go read the Emancipation Proclamation, go read, and let's talk about it.
You leave me speechless. I think part of what I'm thinking while I'm listening to you is that with the COVID-19 and with the fact that we've got kids all over the place when they come back to school next year. So my mind's kind of jumping ahead to what are we going to do next year? I'm almost thinking that the way you're talking, we need to have one of those personalized plans for every student based on what they've gotten this year, where their gaps are, and try to help each individualized student, which would then come into that mastery learning piece and helping kids where they are.
100%. I mean, neither you nor I are going to be able to dictate, you know, what districts do. But I think if I were approaching next year, I would have a great online learning plan in place, because, you know, a lot of hybrid models seem to me very difficult to implement. So what are you going to do? Send half the kids on Mondays and Wednesdays and half the kids on Tuesdays and Thursdays? And then what? You're only covering half the content. I mean, how many schools can really space kids out? And then school's going to be closed. We'll be in the same situation again for 3 months. And I think what I wish the message would be, I wish, you know, where I lived, what the administrators would say to the teachers is, hey, this is going to be your role. It's actually taking something off your shoulders. You don't have to produce all of the content. And now your role is to kind of coach, encourage, mentor, check in, get some data, right? And I don't know, I don't think it's a harder job for teachers. I think it's a different job, but it requires a kind of collective reconceptualization.
So if you were I always used to say this at my school, if I was the king of the forest, so if you were on the school board or you're the king of the forest, how would you restructure schools? What would be your best thinking?
Short term or long term? I mean, how would I get through the crisis, or what would I do?
Yeah, do the crisis and then long term. I'd like to hear both.
Right. Crisis, I would prepare to be online, and I would adapt off of that. Again, to me, and maybe, you know, I'm sure you have people that know better, but I've read a ton, and I've been in a campaign for whatever, almost 2 months now, so I've thought a lot about it. A lot of the hybrid models have really daunting problems. So how does busing work? I'm a parent. Am I going to put my kid on a bus? I don't know. Maybe not if a lot of people were sick. What are you going to do? Run twice as many buses with half as many people? That's very expensive. My district spends $6 million a year on busing. So I would want to have a great online model in place. And I think with older kids, this works fine. You should just be running class. I think with younger kids, you can do a lot of mastery learning. With much younger kids, I've heard people say it doesn't work so well. At the same time, the woman who runs the Head Start program in Manhasset just told me that she thinks they've actually done better with online learning with their younger kids, with 3-year-olds through 5-year-olds. I was like, do you have data? And she's like, we actually collected, so we'll have it. You may need smaller groups with kindergartners and first graders, but that's what I do. I would shift a lot of resources. I originally used the word repurposing of personnel. I guess repurpose objectifies them. You know, look, it's hard to do art. It's hard to do specials in this environment. You can't run a band. You could do some individual music lessons. So I think in the short term, and I don't know whether teachers unions would abide this, I would think it's kind of an all hands on deck for instructional services. And I would put a lot of resources into tech support. When I was at Appalachian State, I had an amazing woman. This isn't that hard, but she facilitated it for me. I didn't even have to do anything. And I would love, if I'm a teacher, the thing that would drive me crazy if dealing with the connectivity issues was my responsibility. The teacher should have to teach, should just have to teach, and we should make sure that he or she is in the position to do their job. So the tech, you know, our district hired a new coach. I'm like, oh, that's great, because there's not going to be any sports. Like, and the tech person was saying, I need more resources. Long term, you know, I would invest in this capacity. I don't think it's a major investment. Like I said, I think it's amazing to have the capacity to do meetings online, to do some classes online. If you have a kid who's accelerated and wants to go take a college class, but you want them to be physically present, I think that's an amazing capacity to have. We run schools in a very labor and capital intensive way. School buildings are very expensive to maintain, and labor is extremely expensive. So if this opens the door to kind of strategically, you know, allowing some opportunities that we can kind of look beyond the walls of the school. You know, if I had an overcrowded school, which would I rather do? If I had an overcrowded district, would I rather build a new building for $50 million? Or would I say, you know what, for our 12th graders, we're going to take one class and we're going to put it online. That frees up this number of classrooms. So, you know, that's the type of investment I would make. I think Khan Academy is great. And my understanding is that there are other programs out there that the NWEA, I think, even has something that's like it. So the more individualized content that's available to kids, the better. I mean, whatever your feeling about testing is, and I'm probably middle of the road on it. If it's a way to help the student to individualize the best learning plan for them, well, then every educator is behind it, as opposed to a way of separating the people that we're going to designate the high learners from the low learners. I'll tell you one other thing I would do. My dad did this, and I told you he was principal of Jericho, which is one of the top rated high schools in the country. He ended tracking. He said, anybody wants to take an AP course, you take an AP course. I don't understand why we don't do that. And I think the idea of designating a group of learners as whatever you want to call them, but substandard, right, is enormously damaging to people, because we're saying that we don't believe that you have the capacity to learn. And, you know, I think if you focus on individualized learning within classes, whatever that impetus to create homogeneous groupings is, I think goes away to some extent. So I also think, last thing I'll say, we know that research experiences really are transformative for kids. Getting a kid into a project that they work on with a mentor, that is like the single biggest predictor of college graduation, and it's a huge predictor of high school satisfaction. So could we reinvest a little bit so that we produce those experiences for everybody and not just the richest kids, I mean, or the smartest kids? And, you know, maybe there's some trade-offs in that. But I think the technology opens the door to a lot of that.
Yeah, project-based learning is awesome. To be able to have kids who invest in some kind of a project and to see that to the very end result. I've seen it with teachers as far as action research too, where if you have a teacher who says, if I do blah, 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 I believe it will, whatever, and they do it. And I've yet to see somebody who does an action research project where they're not successful, because they're going to keep tweaking it until they get it right.
There's tons of data to back up what you're saying. So it's not just you who feels that way.
Cool. In your article, you write, we found the collective will to bail out airlines that used to reserve to repurchase stocks and to fund forgivable loans to colleges and universities with massive endowments. Can we find the collective will to bring school to the students who need it the most? Can you share more of your thinking behind that?
Well, I guess this is political, but I mean, you know, where is our money? Where is federal money most needed right now? It's needed in schools. It's needed for kids, particularly kids from poorer families. This would be the time to invest in summer programs for those kids, for everybody. But, you know, I don't, I understood the reason to bail out banks, because I do understand that capitalism is kind of dependent on the banking structure. I don't see anything as being dependent on having airlines, and if they go bankrupt, somebody will buy them up. But man, you're going to have and you know, if you have another disrupted year, you're going to have a generation of kids with a massive deficit, and it's going to be the poorest kids within that group that are going to have the largest deficit. And boy, it's you know, there's so many things we can't solve, but we can make sure that every kid has a computer in the United States. That we can solve. We can make sure every kid has access to Wi-Fi. That we can solve. And we can make sure every kid, you know, has a plan for what are you going to do over the summer and gets a check-in. That we could solve. We could do even more than that, but that's pretty low-hanging fruit, in my opinion.
So I have to ask you, because of your criminal justice background, we're sitting here in just some crazy times with social justice and all the racial tension and stuff. I just would like to hear your feeling on, you know, like where we are right now, how you see this playing out with the students in your college, the students that you deal with, and just your thoughts.
Well, I mean, I'll say one kind of balance thing, and I think people need to, you know, I teach a lot of people who go on to be police officers, and Karen and I had a minute about unions earlier, and I'm going to harken back to that. Every cop I know looks at the George Floyd video and says that they're appalled by it, right? So I think there's an instinct that humans have, and we certainly do this, Democrats do this to Republicans and vice versa, to paint people with broad brushes. And cops are not bad. Almost all cops are really, really good. And they get into it because they want to help people. Are some of them racist? Sure. Are some teachers racist? Sure. Are some racist teachers? And right, vice versa. There's always going to be groups like that. So I think it's important to acknowledge that to start. Is there systemic racism in policing and in education? Of course. we have decades of data that show disparities that correlate with race for students in school, disparities of access, disparities in who gets shot by police officers, disparities for who gets wrongfully convicted, who gets held on bail, who gets held without bail. How does it change? I mean, I think it's great. I mean, I think what's hard about these things is I remember when I was in college, like apartheid, so everybody was trying to get, colleges to divest from South Africa until they ended apartheid. And it seemed unmovable. And then it moved and you're like, oh, we got over that. So it's like you're shaking against the fence and it won't come down and it won't come down and it'll come down. So this conversation is long overdue. The reforms aren't easy, right? There is, I'm as wacko a liberal as they come. And even I think that you need police departments. And I would say you need some of them to have guns. Maybe not everybody needs to have a gun. But I do think, I'll relate it back to education. The truth of education in America is that education is segregated. It's just segregated in a different way. So I don't know the numbers. What's the richest community in Connecticut? Greenwich, New Canaan? Good ones, right? Okay, I'll look it up, but I'm going to guess that I'm going to guess the New Canaan isn't highly diverse, just as Manhasset isn't highly diverse where I live. And Manhasset spends $30,000 per student. Jericho spends $40,000 per student, and Roosevelt, which is on the South Shore as a poor community of color, spends about $16,000 per student. That's segregation. That there's no legal requirement that prevents somebody, no legal barrier to somebody from Hempstead from buying their way into Manhasset. But, there's an enormous practical barrier, and I can't get into Jericho. And, until we have an honest conversation with that, I mean, what fixes these things is people living together. I think the most hopeful thing in New York is that a majority of police officers are not white. And I think that changes the dynamic within the police department. It changes the perception of the police department. So these conversations about how we bring different people into the system make a huge difference. And you mentioned, like, I'm fixated on, I think how do you desegregate New Canaan and Manhasset? Those are hard conversations. Those touch on, now you're touching on private property. But we can desegregate Harvard and Yale, and they have not done their bit, not by a long shot. And when you look at the number of people who come from poor backgrounds, who manage to, ascend their way into heaven, it is tiny, and they have the resources to do it. Harvard has a, $40 billion endowment. They have the mandate to do it. They are nonprofit institutions. They get a massive tax break that exempts the interest on their endowment, and they don't do it. And they don't do it because they let in legacies, kids fathers, mothers who went to Harvard and Yale, big donors, and athletes. And, that is a massive barrier to access. And so what is really sad, and I think those things, the way elite private colleges work, filter down. And so why do people want to live where I live? Well, you want to know what our community turns around? It turns around lacrosse. This game that 90% of college lacrosse players are white. Nobody watches on TV, but they know that Harvard and Yale and Johns Hopkins want to have good lacrosse teams, so they see it as a way to get their kid in. And, what poor kid grows up playing lacrosse? And so that is doable. And I do think some of that would filter down. It wouldn't end it, I'll just say one more thing, Rosie. I told my wife that if I really did what I wanted to do in Manhasset, what I would do is say, hey, we're going to take 20 kids from the poorest community in Long Island, and we're going to bring them into our community. And she's like, oh, they'll actually lynch you if you do that. And I was like, might be true.
Interesting. Well, we actually do that in Connecticut with Project Choice, where we have, I know in my husband's district, where we bring people from Hartford into Avon, which is his school district, and do some of that. So
that is awesome, and I'm going to go read about that as soon as we get off.
Perfect.
Is that a state program?
It's a state program, yeah, and it has to do with segregation way back when, and probably before my time.
That is
But
fantastic.
we've been doing it in Connecticut. At least I was a principal 21 years ago, and I think we started Project Choice about 20 years ago. But yeah, he's got kids from Hartford coming into Avon Public Schools.
That is fantastic.
Yeah. So back to what you were just saying, is your book, Harvard's Broken Promise, How Elite Colleges Have Betrayed the American Dream, were you just giving us a synopsis of?
I was giving you the teaser for that. But
Cool,
I've written a
cool.
bunch of, I've been on this for about 5 or 6 years. I started when it was my 25th reunion. I had no attachment to the college. I wasn't going. And I wrote a bunch of pieces. So I got my first op-ed in the Times was about legacy admissions. And then I wrote a piece in a long piece in Huffington Post about how my perception of class. Like, obviously I was white, so that wasn't challenging, but being middle class was a thing. It really shaped my experience. I think people saw me as very middle class, and I saw myself as an outsider. And I've stuck on it. And then I just have read so much about it now. I'm like, they're terrible. And it's like, the Varsity Blues stuff, which is obviously terrible, but the Varsity Blues stuff is manifestation of it. Varsity Blues would never happen but for the underlying inequities in the system. So it just shouldn't be, you shouldn't fake your way onto being on the crew team. You just shouldn't get in because you're on the crew team. Who cares whether USC has a good crew team? Cambridge and Oxford have club sports. The Sorbonne has club sports, and they're fine. MIT doesn't have legacy admissions. University of California, Berkeley doesn't have legacy admissions. They're fine. These things become their crutches that we hold on to because of the angst that change causes us. But I promise you, if Harvard does away with legacy admissions, they will still have a ton of money, and they will not drop to number 27 in the rankings. They'll be fine.
Can't wait to read your book. Okay. Another question. You write in your document, your article, hidden within the tragedy of coronavirus is an opportunity, the chance to transform schools and schooling. The pandemic invites us to reconsider long unchallenged assumptions about how we teach. What is our call to action?
I mean, first of all, it's the minimum. It's let's satisfy the minimum. Let's teach. Where teachers, our calling is to teach. If the post office stopped delivering mail during the pandemic, everybody would say, hey, they lose $5 billion a year. Maybe we wouldn't need them all along. If public schools stop teaching, then people are going to say, look, hey, we got along okay without it, and I pay $15,000 a year in taxes. Let me have my money back. But it's greater than that. I'm speaking with you and a group of Connecticut teachers, and we could go bring in a group of Arkansas teachers, and we could work together. So instead of let's talking about race in my, social studies classroom in Manhasset, let's have a conversation with a bunch of people of color from Montgomery or something like that, and let's actually have the conversation. So there are all these physical and geographical barriers that just don't need to exist anymore. I don't even have to I'm so heartened to hear what you said about Project Choice, but you don't even need to bust the kids in from Montgomery. Let's just meet online with them. Let's have joint social studies classes. And, if you want to go take a college class with somebody in another part of the country, do it. But, we are locked into a physical and time structure that comes from, you won't believe this, but my undergraduate thesis was on schools in New York City in the 1850s. And it was called the Lancasterian model, and it was to prepare people to work in factories. We work in factories. The bell rings, shift change, you're going from first to second period. I mean, why? No lawyer works that way, right? No white collar job is structured that way. So why are we doing it that way? And it's just kind of, this is the way we've always done it. So we need to keep doing it that way.
Exactly. And you're so right on. So we've given the people today that are listening to us a lot to think about as far as educational equity, access, how we can rethink schools. And I think one of the great things maybe coming from this pandemic is the use of technology, and how maybe we can use technology to finally do things smarter. Because I know at CAS we've been talking about next year not having people drive into CAS in the center of the state for every one of our meetings, but having people have the option. If you want to come in and be knee to knee, eye to eye, face to face, you can do that. If you want to just zip in because you know that you've got a meeting right after school and you've got a PTA meeting and you've just barely got enough time to get in and back, you can
Great.
you can meet. So maybe we're going to get smarter at what we're doing and use technology that way. But before we close down, just what are your final thoughts? What would you like us to take away from this conversation?
I mean, mostly I'm heartened. Mostly I feel like, even after having gone through what I just went through, I do think people see it. I mean, I think it's, what is it? The arc of history is long and it bends towards justice. Schools are going to change. Racism is going to end. We're going to convert to renewable energy, right? All of these things will happen. It's a question of how long it takes to happen. And I know from my interaction, and there's a lot of data to support this, that kids get it. Kids are way more tolerant than they were when I was a kid. And kids understand climate change. Kids don't like racism. And kids understand that schools don't need to work the way they do. Not everybody, but the overwhelming majority of people. So I believe if you're sitting there and you're like, things don't make sense to me, can I make them better? But it seems really daunting. Speak up, because I am sure that a lot of people, and especially a lot of young people, agree with you. And nothing changes unless anybody says something.
Exactly, and I think that's what we're starting to hear all across, at least I am across the state, that our students are fearless, our students are ready to start talking, and I'm hoping that they're going to help lead us into the next generation of where we're going to be able to build those relationships and tear down some of the walls that we've built so far. So, thank you so much for coming in today to talk with us, and you've given us a lot to think about as we close out schools and as we think about schools for next year. We look forward to continuing to follow you and your career, especially as it relates to equity and access for all students. And again, congratulations on your latest book contract. I can't wait to read all about it. And when it comes out in 2022, I think is the time. And again, it's been a pleasure talking with you today.
Likewise, Rosie, Karen, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who listened.
Finally, I'd like to thank everyone who's attended the special CAS Town Hall webinar today and remind all of our viewers that next Tuesday, June 23rd, we have another special webinar with Tom Mooney at 3:00 p.m. Tom will be discussing current issues and concerns and addressing questions submitted by our members. Anyone who knows Tom knows that this will be a very hot ticket, so make sure that you register for a special webinar with Tom Mooney and send in your questions so that you can get those answered. And once again, I want to thank Professor Evan Mandery for being here today to share his knowledge, experiences, and expertise with us on this very special webinar. And I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us today. The webinar was recorded and will be posted on the CAS website, so please recommend it to your friends and to your colleagues. And even though it may be the longest summer vacation ever, we hope that you will have a fun vacation, stay safe, and enjoy a relaxing summer. Take care, everyone.